Though Mammachi had conical corneas and was already practically blind, Pappachi would not help her with the pickle making because he did not consider pickle making a suitable job for a high-ranking ex-government official like him. He had always been a jealous man, so he greatly resented the attention his wife was suddenly getting. He slouched about the compound in his immaculately tailored suits, weaving sullen circles around mounds of red chilies and freshly powdered yellow turmeric, watching Mammachi supervise the buying, the weighing, the salting and drying of limes and tender mangoes. Every night, he beat her with a brass flour vase. The beatings weren't new. What was new was only the frequency with which they took place. One night, Pappachi broke the bow of Mammachi's violin and threw it in the river. Then, Chaco came home for a summer vacation from Oxford. He had grown to be a big man and was, in those days, strong from rowing for Balliol. A week after he arrived, he found Pappachi beating Mammachi in the study room. Chaco strode into the room, caught Pappachi's vase hand, and twisted it around his back. "I never want this to happen again," he told his father. For the rest of that day, Pappachi sat in the veranda and stared stonily out at the ornamental garden, ignoring the plates of food that Coach Maria brought him. Late at night, he went into his study and brought out his favorite mahogany rocking chair. He put it down in the middle of the driveway and smashed it into little bits with a plumber's monkey wrench. He left it there in the moonlight, a heap of varnished wicker and splintered wood. He never touched Mammachi again. But he never spoke to her either, as long as he lived. When he needed anything, he used Coach Maria or Baby Kachama as intermediaries. In the evenings, when he knew visitors were expected, he would sit on the veranda and sew buttons that weren't missing onto his shirts, to create the impression that Mammachi neglected him. To some small degree, he did succeed in further corroding Imanum's view of working wives. He bought the sky blue Plymouth from an old Englishman in Moon Na. He became a familiar sight in Imanum, coasting importantly down the narrow road in his wide car, looking outwardly elegant, but sweating freely inside his woolen suits. He wouldn't allow Mammachi or anyone else in the family to use it, or even to sit in it. The Plymouth was Pappachi's revenge. Pappachi had been an imperial entomologist at the Pusa Institute. After independence, when the British left, his designation was changed from imperial entomologist to joint director, entomology. The year he retired, he had risen to a rank equivalent to director. His life's greatest setback was not having had the moth that he had discovered named after him. It fell into his drink one evening while he was sitting in the veranda of a rest house after a long day in the field. As he picked it out, he noticed its unusually dense dorsal tufts. He took a closer look. With growing excitement, he mounted it, measured it, and the next morning, placed it in the sun for a few hours for the alcohol to evaporate. Then, he caught the first train back to Delhi. To taxonomic attention, and he hoped fame. After 6 unbearable months of anxiety, to Pappachi's intense disappointment, he was told that this moth had finally been identified as a slightly unusual race of a well-known species that belonged to the tropical family Lamantriidae. The real blow came 12 years later when, as a consequence of a radical taxonomic reshuffle, lepidopterists decided that Pappachi's moth was, in fact, a separate species and genus, unknown to science. By then, of course, Pappachi had retired and moved to Imanum. It was too late for him to assert his claim to the discovery. His moth was named after the acting director of the Department of Entomology, a junior officer whom Pappachi had always disliked. In the years to come, even though he had been ill-humored long before he discovered the moth, Pappachi's moth was held responsible for his black moods and sudden bouts of temper. Its pernicious ghost, grey, fury, and with unusually dense dorsal tufts, haunted every house that he ever lived in. It tormented him and his children, and his children's children. Until the day he died, even in the stifling heat, every single day, Pappachi wore a well-pressed, three-piece suit, and his gold pocket watch. On his dressing table, next to his cologne and silver hairbrush, he kept a picture of himself, as a young man, with his hair slicked down, taken in a photographer's studio in Vienna, where he had done the 6-month diploma course that had qualified him to apply for the post of imperial entomologist. It was during those few months they spent in Vienna that Mammachi took her first lessons on the violin. The lessons were abruptly discontinued when Mammachi's teacher, Launska Tiefenthal, made the mistake of telling Pappachi that his wife was exceptionally talented and in his opinion was potentially concert class. Mammachi pasted in the family photograph album the clipping from the Indian Express that reported Pappachi's death. It said, noted entomologist, Sri Banan John Eppe, son of late Reverend John Eppe, of Imenam, suffered a massive heart attack, and passed away at the Kottayam General Hospital last night. He developed chest pains around 1:05 a.m. and was rushed to hospital. The end came at 2:45 a.m. Sri Eppe had been keeping indifferent health since last 6 months. He is survived by his wife Soshama and 2 children. At Pappachi's funeral, while Mammachi was crying, her contact lenses slid around in her eyes. Amma told the twins that Mammachi was crying more because she was used to him than she loved him. She was used to having him slouching around the pickle factory and was used to being beaten from time to time. Amma said that human beings were creatures of habit, and it was amazing the kind of things they could get used to. You only have to look around you, Amma said, to see that beatings with brass vases were the least of them. After the funeral, Mammachi asked Rahel to help her to locate and remove her contact lenses with the little orange pipette that came in its own case. Rahel asked Mammachi whether, after Mammachi died, she could inherit the pipette. Amma took her out of the room and smacked her. I never want to hear you discussing people's deaths with them again, she said. Esther said, Rahel deserved it for being so insensitive. The photograph of Pappachi in Vienna, with his hair slicked down, was reframed and put up in the drawing room. He was a photogenic man, dapper and carefully groomed, with a little man's largish head. He had an incipient second chin that would have been emphasized had he looked down or nodded. In the photograph, he had taken care to hold his head high enough to hide his double chin, yet not so high as to appear haughty. His light brown eyes were polite, yet maleficent, as though he was making an effort to be civil to the photographer while plotting to murder his wife. He had a little fleshy knob on the center of his upper lip that drooped down over his lower lip in a sort of effeminate pout, the kind that children who suck their thumbs develop. He had an elongated dimple on his chin, which only served to underline the threat of a lurking manic violence. A sort of contained cruelty. He wore khaki jodhpurs, though he had never ridden a horse in his life. His riding boots reflected the photographer's studio lights. An ivory-handled riding crop lay neatly across his lap. There was a watchful stillness to the photograph that lent an underlying chill to the warm room in which it hung. When he died, Pappachi left trunks full of expensive suits and a chocolate box full of cufflinks that Chaco distributed among the taxi drivers in Kottayam. They were separated and made into rings and pendants for unmarried daughters' dowries. When the twins asked what cufflinks were to link cuffs together, Amu told them. They were thrilled by this morsel of logic in what had so far seemed an illogical language. Cuff plus link equals cufflink. This, to them, rivaled the precision and logic of mathematics. Cufflinks gave them an inordinate satisfaction and a real affection for the English language. Amu said that Pappachi was an incurable British CCP, which was short for Chi Chi Poach, and in Hindi meant shit wiper. Chaco said that the correct word for people like Pappachi was Anglophile. He made Rahel and Esther look up Anglophile in the Reader's Digest, Great Encyclopedic Dictionary. It said, person well disposed to the English. Then Esther and Rahel had to look up the word dispose. Chaco said that in Pappachi's case, dispose meant bring mind into certain state. Which, Chaco said, meant that Pappachi's mind had been brought into a state which made him like the English. Chaco told the twins that, though he hated to admit it, they were all Anglophiles. They were a family of Anglophiles, pointed in the wrong direction, trapped outside their own history, and unable to retrace their steps, because their footprints had been swept away. He explained to them that history was like an old house, at night, like the history house, with all the lamps lit, and ancestors whispering inside.